Gene I'd known for many years, but we'd never worked together, and he was in a mood at that time.
You would think that after nearly a century in the spotlight, Clint Eastwood would have let old grudges fade. But some things don't fade with time. After decades, he's finally letting the truth slip. And it's not just one name. Clint Eastwood names the 5 celebrities he hated. Some of the names might surprise you. Number 5. Leonardo DiCaprio. Leonardo DiCaprio has been in the spotlight for as long as we can remember. He was still just a teenager when he appeared in What's Eating Gilbert Grape, and from that point on his life was set under the glare of the Hollywood lights. Since then, he has picked up fame and money, and eventually that long-awaited Oscar. More than anything, he has built this incredible reputation by teaming up with some of the best directors out there. Scrolling through his list of films is like flipping through the greatest hits of movie legends. Steven Spielberg gave him Catch Me If You Can. Christopher Nolan had him dive deep into dreams with Inception. Baz Luhrmann turned him into Romeo, then Gatsby. Quentin Tarantino handed him unforgettable roles in Django Unchained and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And then there's Martin Scorsese, who you might refer to as probably the most essential director Leo has ever worked with. Together they made The Departed, Shutter Island, The Wolf of Wall Street, and Killers of the Flower Moon. That partnership changed everything for Leo, pushing him beyond the heartthrob image. But one name disappeared from his orbit for all the directors he has ever worked with: Clint Eastwood. In 2011, Leo took on the role of J. Edgar Hoover in Eastwood's biopic J. Edgar. At first, it seemed like a dream team. Leo was deeply involved. He was so passionate about playing Hoover that he cut his usual $20 million fee to just $2 million to help with the budget. This decision to Leo wasn't just about saving money, it showed just how much he cared about the role. He threw himself into it completely, sitting through long hours of makeup, fake teeth, facial prosthetics, and even a nose stretcher. He immersed himself in the role to fully portray the character. But even with that kind of commitment, the shoot wasn't smooth behind the scenes. Clint Eastwood is known for being quick and low-key on set. He doesn't like yelling action or doing take after take. Instead, he says, "in your own time," and often goes with whatever happens first. He has usually been described as a consummate director. Some actors found his style refreshing. However, for others, especially someone like DiCaprio, who loves diving deep and exploring a scene from every angle, that style would feel rushed and almost unfinished. Dame Judi Dench, also in J. Edgar, once shared a moment that captured the difference. She said she and Leo were chatting when Clint suddenly wrapped the scene. Judy turned to Leo and asked, "Are we going to do this scene?" Leo replied, "He's done it. Just one take," and Clint had what he needed. Judy thought it was great. She called it heaven because they could start at 9 and leave by 4:30. But for Leo, it wasn't so easy. He's the actor who wants to explore, push, and go again. So when he asked for another take, and Clint said they were done, that reply didn't sit well. Armie Hammer, who played Clyde Tolson in the film, later said something similar. Clint used one of his rehearsals as the confirmed scene for the movie, which isn't the norm. On the rehearsal scene, Armie still had his script in hand, but he wasn't entirely in character yet, and that's the version Clint went with. Now, Clint has never hidden how he works. He once told Film Comment that he prefers dialogue to sound natural, as if it were being said for the first time. However, Leo, on his part, is wired completely differently. Director Alejandro Inarritu once noted that even when Leo gets the perfect take, he'll still look at you and say, "Let's do one more." So when you step back and look at it, it's no surprise things didn't click between them. Leo came into the project ready to disappear into the role and fine-tune every detail, while Clint came in wanting to keep things loose and spontaneous. Despite their different takes on production, J. Edgar still turned out solid. Leo earned a Golden Globe nomination, and many people praised the performance. But you can feel the distance between them even now because, as it stands, there have been no talks of a second movie together and no signs they will team up again. And it makes you wonder, what if it had worked out? What if they had found some middle ground and gone on to make something else? Number 4. Gene Hackman. When directors talk about Gene Hackman, there's a kind of reverence in their voice, like they are describing a storm they had to prepare for, but one that left behind a different kind of unforgettable beauty once it passed. Working with Hackman wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. Gene Hackman started as just another name trying to make it in film, and it wasn't until Lilith in 1964 that people began to notice him. He won 2 Oscars, one for a role where he played a tough New York cop who didn't slow down for anyone, and another decades later where he showed up as a small-town sheriff. However, there's something about Gene Hackman that directors always notice quickly. Gene Hackman was not an actor who liked to be watched too closely while working. Wes Anderson had a moment like that early on while filming the Royal Tenenbaums. He said he couldn't help glancing at the monitor during a take, but what he wanted most was to keep his eyes on Hackman. So in the middle of this take, Gene suddenly stops, looks off camera, and says, "I can see you frowning and moving around over there." We got the message, and he moved the monitor to another spot where Gene wouldn't feel that pressure. From that moment on, Gene knew exactly where Wes was, but he wasn't in his line of sight, which made all the difference. Clint Eastwood, who has worked with Gene, also saw the same thing in him. The very first scene Clint shot with Gene was also with Morgan Freeman, and just a couple of lines into the take, Clint suddenly called cut. But not because anything was wrong with the acting. To him, there was no way this camera was rolling because what he was seeing was too good to be real. So he acted headfirst on instinct. He told the crew to stop, quickly checked the equipment, and once everything was good, he just let Gene and Morgan rehearse freely. Clint didn't interrupt. He just followed Gene around and let the scene breathe. You don't need to over-direct him when working with someone like Hackman. You give him space and he brings it all to the table. Gene is one of those actors who thrives when he is left alone to find his rhythm. He doesn't like a lot of extra noise or second guessing. He moves on if he nails a scene in one take, which he often does. He doesn't want to hear, "That was great, but maybe we could also try," because that's when things start to look different. Now it's far from what you might be thinking. Gene Hackman isn't the kind of actor who finds handling directions challenging. In contrast, what frustrates him is when people aren't sure what they want or when they start experimenting on the scene. And if a director is indecisive, Gene's patience wears thin. All of this connects to another great story, one that Kevin Costner once shared about working with Clint Eastwood on A Perfect World. It was Costner's first day on set, and after the very first take of his first shot, Clint said, "All right, we're moving on." Costner was stunned. He turned to Clint and said, "Wait, what do you mean? I want to do another take. We're doing another one. I don't take this type of treatment from anyone." And Clint, known for being calm, walked right up to him, got in his face and said, "Well, you're going to take it from me. We're moving on." That moment right there, it speaks volumes about Clint's style and why he and Gene probably understood each other well. Now here's what you might not know. Eastwood and Hackman go way back, and that bond even pulled Gene out of retirement at least once. After Gene had stepped away from acting, he was offered a role in Unforgiven, but he initially turned it down. The script was too violent for his taste, and at that point in his life, he was more focused on his family, mainly because his daughters had expressed concerns about the roles he was playing. He was done with that kind of violence. However, Clint wasn't ready to take no for an answer. The film was deeply personal for Clint Eastwood, as it wasn't just any kind of Western. It had heart, tragedy, and something to say about violence. So Clint went to see Hackman in person. He laid it all out, explaining that Unforgiven wasn't about glorifying violence. It was about a broken man and a retired armed user who picked up his weapon one last time to bring justice after a terrible attack on a prostitute. And that changed everything. Hackman eventually said yes, and it turned out to be one of the most powerful performances of his career. The film itself went on to earn over $159 million at the box office on just a $14 million budget. What's more, it won the Oscar for Best Picture. Gene's performance as the brutal sheriff was unforgettable, and Clint knew from the start that he was the only actor who could bring that role to life the way it was needed. So when you hear Clint or Wes talk about working with Gene Hackman, you realize they are talking about someone who doesn't just act. He disappears into his roles, but only if you let him work how he needs to. Give him space and clarity, and he will give you gold. However, while Clint Eastwood had nothing but deep respect for Gene Hackman, not every actor earned that same kind of admiration. There's one Hollywood star who pushed Clint's patience to the limit and nearly found himself blacklisted from ever working with him again. So who was it? And what exactly did he do to land on Eastwood's bad side? Let's find out. Number 3. John Wayne. When you think of Westerns, real Westerns, the kind that defines eras and shapes what we imagine the Old West to be, two names almost always rise above the rest: John Wayne and Clint Eastwood. They didn't just act in Westerns, they became symbols of the genre. But what's wild is that even though they dominated the same space and owned the cowboy image for generations, they never made a movie together, not one. And the reason why? Well, that's where the story gets messy. It had nothing to do with timing and everything to do with politics, pride, and two very different views of what a hero looks like. Most people knew him as John Wayne, but before all the fame, he was Marion Robert Morrison, a kid who became one of the most recognizable faces in film. They started calling him Duke, and that name stuck long before he became the go-to guy for westerns and war movies. His career stretched further than most, starting in the film era and lasting well into Hollywood's rougher and more modern days. He was in almost 180 films and kept drawing crowds for over 30 years. Even long after he's gone, he's still remembered as one of the greatest to do it. Yet while he was alive, a few feuds were hard to forget. John Wayne didn't like Clint Eastwood, and the feeling was mutual. As Eastwood's fame took off in the 1960s, thanks to those spaghetti westerns, Wayne started to feel a little less off. And here's why. Wayne had spent his whole career as the symbol of the classic cowboy, but Eastwood's characters were a lot different than his. When Eastwood stepped behind the camera and started directing films like High Plains Drifter and The Outlaw Josie Wales, he was rewriting the genre. Audiences genuinely loved this era, but Wayne, he saw a world where right and wrong were getting harder to tell apart, and to him, that wasn't evolution. Wayne believed westerns were supposed to stand for something: honor, country, tradition. His films, especially the ones he made with director John Ford, painted a picture of brave men with clear values. Yes, they faced conflict, but it was always in service of something noble. Even in films like Fort Apache, where things got more complicated, Wayne still stood for a particular American idealism. So when Clint Eastwood came along with characters who didn't care much about right or wrong, only survival and personal justice, Wayne took it personally. The deeper issue, though, wasn't just about tone. It was about influence. Eastwood was becoming the new face of westerns, and for a man like John Wayne, who had built an empire in his image, that was hard to accept. Eastwood wasn't just doing westerns differently, he was doing them better. He was directing, and he was succeeding at it. Films like High Plains Drifter were morally complicated, making you question who the hero was, and that, to John Wayne, felt like a step too far. The High Plains Drifter was the final straw. Eastwood's character in that film, mysterious, violent, and nearly cruel, was everything Wayne didn't want to see in a Western hero. To him, this wasn't just some fable. It was a misrepresentation of the West and the men who settled it. And Wayne let Eastwood know precisely how he felt. He sent him a letter and told him the film wasn't about the people who pioneered the West. However, here's what makes it all the more heartbreaking. Eastwood had contacted Wayne because he genuinely wanted to work with him. There was a project, a film called The Hostiles, written by Larry Cohen, and Eastwood was meant to play a young gambler who wins half an estate from an older man, a role explicitly designed for John Wayne. Eastwood liked the idea. He optioned the script and sent it to Wayne, hoping they could finally share the screen. But Wayne took one look and refused. He said it felt like just another spaghetti western, and even after Eastwood revised the script and sent it again, Wayne still said no. Yet he did not give up. Eastwood still gave it one more shot. This time Wayne's son Mike handed him the script while they were sailing. Wayne didn't even open it. He just looked at the title page, scoffed, and reportedly muttered, "This piece of crap again," before tossing it into the ocean. That was the last collaboration idea with John Wayne that crossed Eastwood's mind. The closest the two men ever came to being in the same orbit was when John Wayne starred in The Shootist, his final film, which was directed by Don Siegel, who happened to be one of Eastwood's most trusted collaborators. Eastwood even visited the set, and Wayne, after all those years of silence, finally agreed to meet him. But no movie collaboration came out of their meeting. Wayne passed away in 1979, and with his demise, a particular era of Western culture went along with it too. But Clint Eastwood, he didn't slow down. He kept redefining the genre, and in 1992, he gave the world Unforgiven, a film that didn't just win Best Picture but completely rewrote what a Western could be. With that movie, Eastwood became not just the last great cowboy of cinema, but maybe its most complex one. With Westerns finding new life on television and in theaters, the genre struggled to find another Clint Eastwood. Number 2, Morgan Freeman. Clint Eastwood has always been one of the biggest stars of Hollywood who does not need constant attention to be unforgettable. But then came Morgan Freeman, and with just a few words, he gave everyone a reason to look twice at that legend. And here's the thing, this wasn't some offhand remark from a random co-star. Freeman has always held Eastwood in high regard. Before they ever stood side by side on a film set, Freeman admired his work from afar. When they finally worked together, their respect and what came out of that partnership was nothing short of cinematic gold. Their first film, Unforgiven, won Best Picture and handed Eastwood the Oscar for Best Director. A few years later, they reunited for Million Dollar Baby, and the results were as powerful. Another Best Picture win, another Best Director win for Eastwood, and this time Freeman walked away with the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. Then came Invictus, their third project together. It might not have hit the same heights, but it still pulled in over 120 million worldwide and earned Freeman yet another Oscar nomination, this time for portraying Nelson Mandela. So, with that kind of track record, people were taken aback when Freeman opened up about Eastwood. So, what did he say? In an interview, Morgan revealed that Clint Eastwood's voice wasn't exactly his, and those words changed everything for anyone who grew up hearing that iconic, raspy Eastwood tone in films like Dirty Harry or The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Freeman explained that Eastwood created it with Sergio Leone in his spaghetti western days. When he fills his role in The Man with No Name, he builds that voice as part of the character. Freeman also said that when Clint is not acting, he sounds completely different. However, he did not stop there. He even pointed out something interesting. People still imitate Eastwood using that voice because that's the only version of him the public ever got to hear. Somehow, that little detail shifts your whole view of him because for years, Clint Eastwood didn't just act tough, he sounded tough. That voice helped shape the roles he played. It made him intimidating without ever raising his tone. It made his characters unforgettable. Now, to realize that it was all a choice and part of the performance almost makes the whole thing more impressive. Contrary to what you might be thinking, Freeman wasn't tearing him down. If anything, he was giving Eastwood even more credit. He wasn't just a good actor, but a master at building a persona so complete and believable that it blended into the man himself. But now that we know, it's hard not to think about it every time you see him on screen. If that revelation caught you off guard, wait, because the next story takes us somewhere much more tense. Number 1. Michael Moore. For a man who has built a lifetime out of squinting into the sun and asking punks if they feel lucky, Clint Eastwood has never exactly played it safe. He has never been the type to smooth things over or dodge the tough questions. Even in his 90s, he still is quite a force. He has made a career out of playing characters who shoot first and ask questions later, and honestly, sometimes it feels like Clint himself never dropped the act once the camera stopped rolling. So when Clint Eastwood was asked about people in Hollywood at the age of 94, he couldn't stand them and didn't hesitate. And topping that list is Michael Moore. Now, if you've followed either man's career, this name shouldn't surprise you, because their public feud has been cooking just behind the scenes since the early 2000s. And if there's one thing Eastwood doesn't forget, it's a personal grudge. You don't need to dig too deep to understand why Clint Eastwood can't stand Michael Moore. The two have been at odds for decades, and it mostly comes down to one moment that rubbed Clint the wrong way. It all goes back to Bowling for Columbine, the 2002 documentary that took Michael Moore from a respected indie instigator to a household name. While Moore had already made waves with Roger and Me back in the late 80s, Columbine was the one that hit a national nerve. The film aimed to explore America's deep-rooted relationship with firearms, fear, and violence, and it didn't pull any punches. However, there was one moment in particular that sparked a firestorm. Near the film's end, Moore sat down with Charlton Heston, then president of the NRA, and that meeting has always been a point of contention. Moore said it was a scheduled interview, but critics argue that Heston, who was in his late 70s and possibly already experiencing early signs of Alzheimer's, wasn't fully prepared for what was coming. Moore pushed hard, confronting him with images of young shooting victims and challenging the NRA's response to school shootings. Eventually, Heston got up and walked out. Some viewers applauded Moore's boldness, but others felt it crossed a line, and one of those critics, even though he didn't directly reference the scene, was Clint Eastwood. At a press event a few years later, Eastwood took a pointed jab. "If he ever shows up at my door with a camera, I'll unalive him." A couple of years later, in 2005, Clint and Moore ended up in the same room, and this time it was the National Board of Review Awards dinner in New York. Moore had just come off the heat of Fahrenheit 9/11, and Eastwood was riding high from the success of Million Dollar Baby. Everything seemed all right until Clint stepped up to the podium, and that's when he made that statement. The room went cold and some laughed nervously. But Moore, who had already dealt with threats before and had just recently avoided one that had to do with blowing up his house, didn't find it particularly funny. He later recalled trying to keep a fake smile plastered on his face. To be clear, Eastwood has since said he wasn't being serious. Years later, during a lunch event at CinemaCon, he addressed the controversy again, saying, "Everyone kept saying I was going to unalive Michael Moore, but that's not true," he said. "It isn't a bad idea," he finished with a round of laughter following his statement. However, this attempt to straighten the narrative did not align with Moore. Around the same time, figures like Glenn Beck and Bill O'Reilly were tossing around violent jokes about him on national television. Glenn Beck once said he had considered unliving Moore with his hands, then quickly backtracked sarcastically, "Is this wrong?" On the other hand, Bill O'Reilly made similar comments during an interview with Rudy Giuliani, joking, "Well, I want to unalive Michael Moore, is that right?" Moore, understandably, didn't find any of it amusing. He wrote a lengthy post on Facebook years later detailing the incident with Eastwood and expressing how this kind of hate speech wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous, especially for someone who already had people showing up at his home, making threats, and treating him like public enemy number one. Moore argued that Eastwood wasn't just expressing political disagreement. He was feeding into a culture that mistreats people for having different opinions. And your words have more impact when you're a famous tough guy like Eastwood. Then came American Sniper in 2014, Clint Eastwood's biggest commercial hit, a film that earned over $547 million worldwide and became his highest-grossing project ever. However, while mainstream audiences praised it, Michael Moore had a different take. On Twitter, he criticized snipers as cowards, referencing how a sniper in World War II took out his uncle. He wrote, "Snipers aren't heroes, and invaders are worse." He didn't mention American Sniper by name, but the timing and tone were impossible to miss. He later expanded on his thoughts, describing the film as a mess that distorted history and romanticized violence. In Moore's view, American Sniper promoted harmful stereotypes about Iraqis, portrayed American soldiers in a good versus evil light, and twisted the narrative of the Iraq War into something patriotic rather than problematic. He even compared Eastwood's later films like Gran Torino, which he found to be racially tone-deaf, as signs that something had gone haywire with Clint in recent years. Surprisingly, it wasn't just Moore talking. Others supported his opinions. Penn State professor Sophia McLennan wrote a detailed piece explaining that Eastwood's public jabs and controversial films reflected a particular hostility toward progressive voices like Moore's. She even pinpointed that infamous 2005 dinner speech as a turning point in how Eastwood engaged with political discourse. But here's the strange thing. Moore still expressed a weird admiration for Eastwood despite all this. In his own words, he said, "I like Clint Eastwood and I think he was a great filmmaker." He praised Unforgiven as his favorite Western, applauded Letters from Iwo Jima for its humanity, and acknowledged that Clint had worked with left-wing actors like Sean Penn and Tim Robbins. So when Eastwood was asked who he would name among the celebrities he truly disliked at the age of 94, Michael Moore was at the very top, not because of some petty Hollywood feud, and not even just because of their obvious political differences, but because their worldviews were so fundamentally opposed that it felt personal. Eastwood, known for his no-nonsense, straight-shooter persona, didn't shy away from being blunt. And while some might expect bitterness at that age, his words didn't come off as vindictive, just honest. Now, after everything he has seen and experienced in the industry and in life, Clint Eastwood didn't list those names to stir the pot or rewrite old stories. If anything, it was more of a reflective moment, an insight into the people he never quite saw eye to eye with. And sure enough, his candid comments have stirred up some conversation across fan circles and Hollywood commentators alike. What do you think about his takes on these 5 people? Do they surprise you? Or do they simply reflect the Eastwood we've always known, unfiltered, principled, and fiercely his own man? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Before you go, explore the other videos on your screen.